Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man.
Today, we're looking at Daniel Villegas, who is sentenced to life in prison at the age of 16. John Bunn, who is convicted for a crime he never committed, and Kirsten Labato, who fought to prove her innocence her whole life. Stay tuned as we take you through the most insane reactions of wrongful convicts finally set free.
An El Paso man bringing awareness after spending nearly 20 years behind bars before being acquitted of capital murder. We are talking about Daniel Villegas, whose case made national headlines.
Because we don't trust nobody. So how are you going to trust a stranger to tell your problems to? So we built it in. We got PSD.
Daniel Villegas was 16 years old when his life changed forever. Tried and convicted for a murder that he never committed, Daniel lost his entire childhood to a wrongful sentence. Why? Because of a police detective who would do anything to frame him and protect his own career. The story starts in 1993, when Daniel was an average high school student in El Paso, Texas. He came from a large family, and his loved ones described him as the loudest, funniest, and most expressive person in the room. He had never gotten himself into any trouble and did well at school. So it was a huge shock to everyone when he was arrested for the murder of 18-year-old England and 17-year-old Lazo, both of whom had been shot dead while they were walking home from a party. On the night of April 10th, Armando Lazo and Robert England, along with their friends Jesse Hernandez and Juan Medina, were walking down the intersection of Trans Mountain Road and Electric Street when a car pulled up beside them and someone from the passenger seat started shooting. Medina and Hernandez ran, but the two other boys weren't lucky enough. England was shot in the head and died on the spot, while Lazo received gunshots to his abdomen and thigh and was able to drag his body to a house up the street, which is where the residents found his body. According to the witnesses, they all had heard rounds of gunfire. Later on, the police found 22 shell casings in the street where the crime was committed. The crazy thing, however, is that Medina and Hernandez couldn't identify the culprits. Because the boys were running to save their lives, they weren't able to catch a glimpse of the shooters or the car. But from what they remembered, the ride was maroon or red in color. This launched a massive investigation led by Detective Alfonso Marquez of the El Paso Police Department, who almost became obsessed with solving this case. He first targeted Hernandez, bringing him in for questioning once again. According to Hernandez, at one point, he was almost about to confess to the crime himself because of all the pressure that the detective was putting on him for some reason. The investigation continued, and the first arrest that the police made was of Michael Johnston, a 15-year-old boy. Johnston was put through tremendous amounts of physical and mental torture. Marquez went on to threaten the young boy with sexual assault if he did not confess. Under so much pressure, Johnston ended up confessing to the crime, but he was never charged. Why? Because Marquez himself knew the confession was fake. So, what was this twisted detective really up to? His next suspect was 17-year-old David Rangel. Once again, he did the exact same thing to him. To save his own life, Rangel told the police that his cousin, Daniel Villegas, was the one who had shot Lazo in England with his shotgun. Marquez made Rangel write his statement down without using the word shotgun. Why? Because that wasn't the murder weapon. Rangel's final statement was inconsistent with the witness statements that Medina and Hernandez had given. What's more is that it also contradicted the evidence found at the crime scene. Rangel claimed that Villegas owned a black car, not a red one, and the fact that his cousin had told him that he had chased Lazo and shot him at the house too. But the police never found any shells. By then, he was already charged with the murder. Daniel went to trial in 1994, and while he maintained his innocence, the odds were against him. His cousin Rangel was brought in to testify, and he too claimed that Villegas was just joking about being involved in the murders. Williams and Gonzalez also claimed that their statements against Daniel were forcefully obtained by the detective. And when Daniel took the stand, he too talked about the police officers' violent threats. After a psychological exam, doctors came to the conclusion that Villegas had some emotional problems and mild mental retardation, which might be the reason why he gave in to the police pressure and also why he was making jokes about the crime. Sadly, it was no use, because on August 24th, 1995, Villegas was sentenced to life in prison. He appealed the conviction, but it was rejected, and he had to make peace with spending over 20 years in jail for a crime he hadn't committed.
A once convicted murderer who claims he was forced to confess to a crime he didn't commit will go before a jury again.
In 2012, Judge Sam Medrano suggested that Villegas should be taken to trial all over again. The reason why he said this was because of the obvious inconsistencies in all of the statements that had implicated him. At the same time, there was no evidence of beer being stolen that night from any of the convenience stores that the witnesses had talked about. So it was pretty obvious that the statements were forced out of them. At the same time, one of the witnesses who testified against Daniel was actually in jail at the time of the crime. It was later discovered that instead of questioning these inconsistencies, attorney John Gates and Detective Marquez had made sure not to go down that line of questioning, avoiding the topics altogether. At the same time, the forensic experts had also discovered that Lazo had never been shot in the back, adding another inconsistency to the list. Judge Medrano also questioned Marquez's interrogation methods and found that he had violated Villegas' rights by not even reading him his rights during the entire thing.
That's going there for help, right? He knocking on the door. He opened the door and he collapses in their doorway. But we know at the time that it occurred simply because of the 911 call that came in.
But what really proved Daniel's innocence was the fact that the police had also interviewed brothers Rudy and Javier Flores, who had gotten into a heated argument with England and Lazo a few weeks before they had been murdered. The two brothers had threatened to kill Lazo. Not just that, but their car was also a close match to the one that Medina and Hernandez had described in their statements. Now, the officers had already known about Javier and Rudy driving around with a .22 caliber gun and firing it. And while they had caught them and confiscated the weapon, for some reason Marquez and his team never put two and two together, despite having all the evidence to do so.
Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
In 2018, after spending decades behind bars, Daniel's third trial ended in a full acquittal, allowing him to be the free man that he deserved to be. When he was allowed to be a free man after spending most of his life in prison, Daniel broke down uncontrollably. His attorneys had to hold him up as he kept crying, tears of happiness and relief. Villegas is now working hard to fight for all wrongfully convicted individuals and is actually suing the city of El Paso and 8 police officers on the grounds of them coercing a false confession from him as a teenager, and while also depriving him of his constitutional rights. The complaint also says former Detective Marquez had a lengthy disciplinary record and a history of lying, mentioning multiple examples of alleged misconduct.
This is a family made up partly of faith and hope.
The corrupted officer's poor training and tunnel vision led to Villegas missing the birth of his daughter and led to him developing severe mental health issues because of the physical abuse that he was subjected to by prison guards and inmates. Today, Daniel is trying to rebuild his life from scratch, but adjusting to life after jail isn't easy. He has claimed that he still receives death threats every day and finds it hard to do simple tasks like getting groceries or going to the barber.
Because we don't trust nobody. So how are you going to trust a stranger to tell your problems to? So we built it in. We got PSD. I mean, even to get an ID is, I mean, you need a social security for an ID. You don't have a social security, you need a state Texas ID to get that. I mean, it's hell.
And at UTEP, he gave an emotional account of what it has been like for him just a few years after he won his freedom. Villegas says he found himself waking up at night and knocking on walls to ensure he wasn't dreaming. He would check to see if he really was free and not in prison. And it is hard to trust others after spending so much time in jail for a crime he did not commit.
The kind of physical, mental, and emotional damage that he has gone through because of the misconduct of a corrupt officer will now take Daniel years to reverse.
I was wrongfully accused and convicted of a crime I had no knowledge of and had nothing to do with. It led to me being incarcerated for 17 years and then on parole for another 10 years, which was a total of 27 years for me fighting for my life.
Former NYPD detective Lois Scarcella rose to prominence during the crack epidemic in the 1980s. He was known to obtain convictions from the most difficult of cases. But moving forward, the world would find out that he was responsible for wrongly convicting over 16 people, including the two famous cases of John Bunn and David Rotna. It's easy to say that this is one police officer who would do anything to make sure that he was painted as a public hero, which is what he tried to do in the case of John Bunn. Bunn was only 14 years old when he was accused of murdering a correctional officer who happened to be a friend of Scarcella's. Later on, it would be discovered that Bunn and his friend Rosine Hargrave were wrongfully committed of the crime that led to them spending years in jail. The story takes place at 4 a.m. on August 13, 1991, when two Rikers Island corrections officers, Robert Crossan and Rolando Neisser, were shot in the middle of a robbery while they were off duty and sitting outside in a car. Neisser was shot 5 times and died instantly, while his pal Crossan was shot in the hand and managed to survive. Later on, the survivor went on to describe the robbers as two light-skinned black men in their 20s. The robbers came up to the officers on bicycles and demanded that they give up the car. When Neisser refused to do so, they started shooting at him, forcing him out of the car before stealing it and speeding off. The next day, Lois Scarcella claimed that he had received an anonymous phone call naming 17-year-old Rosine Hargrave as one of the culprits. And what's even stranger is that Scarcella ended up going to the housing project where the two men were shot and ended up running into Hargrave, arresting him then and there. The next day, he said that he had gotten another anonymous tip and arrested 14-year-old John Bunn. In the words of Bunn himself, he was at home sleeping when the shooting had taken place, and he was in his underwear eating breakfast the next morning when Scarcella and his partners broke into his house and arrested him, making him one of the many cases worked by the detective with his partner, Stephen Chimel, all of them being thrown out because of the questionable tactics used by the two men.
That's ridiculous. That is totally ridiculous.
With an attorney by his side, at 68 years old, Detective Louis Scarcella repeatedly said in Brooklyn Supreme Court he couldn't remember every detail from an investigation 2 decades ago.
Do you remember the Trevor Vieira homicide?
No, I don't remember.
Nelson Cruz has so far served 21 years in jail for the homicide.
With an attorney by his side, at 68 years old, Detective Lois Scarcella repeatedly said in Brooklyn Supreme Court he couldn't remember every detail from 2 decades ago. Because of Scarcella's misconduct and personal grudges, several innocent people have spent years in jails, while the officer was free to keep perpetrating his unfair behavior on others. Then, working with Crossan, Scarcella created a photographic lineup. The survivor identified Bunn and Hargrave as the culprits, despite the fact that both of them were dark-skinned instead of his original statement regarding the shooters being light-skinned. Bunn and Hargrave were also not in their 20s, but somehow that was all dismissed and the two young boys were being charged with felony, murder, and assault.
I kind of gave up on certain parts of it. I started feeling like, yo, this is gonna be my life. I was bitten, you know what I'm saying? I look at it like this, I almost let that shit become me. I almost became a monster.
And while blood had been collected from the bicycles that the shooters had left behind, the detective made sure that no tests were performed for some reason. When the trial began, Hargrave's defense attorney tried to bring up the fact that Crossan was involved in some shady behavior, selling stolen clothing from the back of his van that he usually parked in front of the same housing project where he and his friend were attacked, but the judge refused to entertain the thought. What's even sadder though is that when Neisser's car was found, found, the fingerprints on it didn't match Bunn or Hargrave, but no ballistic tests were ever conducted. The trial, including the jury selection, lasted 3 days. On November 24th, 1992, Bunn and Hargrave were convicted of second-degree murder and assault. Hargrave was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, and Bunn was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison.
John Bunn has been waiting for this moment.
So at this time, instead of me allowing them to steal my joy, I started an organization to help others. And I push forward with positive purpose. And that's what I try to tell y'all. And everywhere I go, I speak to the kids and I tell them, when you push for purpose, and you tie your passion to your purpose, and you don't let nobody knock you off of that, because anything is possible. If I'm here today, I made it out of a hole. I made it out of a dark hole where I used to be no hope, where no one used to care about a John Bunn. Now today, John Bunn is bigger than just me. It's about the purpose, about a cause.
In 2013, the exoneration of David Rotna Hargrave filed a new motion for trial. According to Bunn, he was convicted in 1991 primarily on the testimony of the wounded jail guard, which he said was coerced by the cops. He said the officer first described the suspect as a light-skinned black man in his 20s, and Bunn is a dark-skinned 5'2" and was of course only 14 at the time. After he was declared to be a free man, Bunn broke down in tears and went over to the judge, shaking her hands and thanking her over and over again. After being sent to jail as a mere child, Bunn couldn't believe his ears when he was proven innocent from all crimes.
When I was in prison, my grandmother's Jehovah Witness. You know
I grew up Jehovah Witness.
So me too. I always believed in I always know God is real because the way I came up, and I just know He's real. Sometimes I used to ask Him why me? You know what I'm saying? But when I used to write my uncle, he used to be like, yo, that's a question he can answer. But right now, I look at it different.
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man.
Bunn also talked about how unfair it was for him to be convicted a day into the trial, despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime. According to him, the NYPD already knew that detectives, including Scarcella and Schimmel, were violating police procedures and making tainted busts. Bunn was paroled in 2009 and, in 2016, burst into tears in court when he was told he had been cleared. Today, he is using his voice to speak out against other people who have been wrongfully incarcerated for crimes they haven't committed.
I needed to get my life purpose after being wrongfully incarcerated for 17 years. I was illiterate, I couldn't read at the time. But when I started to learn how to read, it changed my life, and it actually put me in a position to be empowered enough to want to fight for my innocence and for my freedom.
All in all, it's crazy to imagine how a corrupted detective had led to the destruction of so many innocent lives.
July 1st, 2001, a homeless man named Duran Bailey was found brutally murdered. Someone left his body in a dumpster across the street from what is now the Palms. An 18-year-old was found guilty of that crime.
Kirsten Labata was 18 years old when she was charged with the 2001 murder of Duran Bailey. For nearly 17 years after that, she had to keep fighting to prove her innocence. Here's how the story goes. On July 8, 2001, a man came across a dead body in a garbage dumpster behind a bank in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was not a pretty sight. The victim had been put through enormous amounts of torture. He had been beaten up, his face showed multiple signs of damage, 6 of his teeth were knocked out, he was stabbed many times all over his body, and finally, his throat was slashed to end his life. When the police discovered his body and ran forensic tests, it was also discovered that his rectum was slashed and his had been cut off too, which the police later found a few feet away from where the body was found. It was a heinous crime, to say the least. What's strange is that while the police were still investigating the site, a woman approached them, claiming that a man named St. Louis and Duran had assaulted her 7 days earlier, and she had a hunch that the body was his. The police later identified the man and was in fact 44-year-old Duran Bailey, known as St. Louis, to his friends. The woman told the police that the man had threatened to murder her if she filed a complaint against him, but according to her words, she did report the incident to the police 3 days before his body was found. She then told the police that she had told a bunch of her male friends and neighbors about the attack and was afraid that one of them might have attacked him in retaliation. However, the detectives didn't go down that route. This was because a few days later, a juvenile probation officer heard a rumor about a woman named Kirsten Lobato. Apparently, she had been going around telling people that she had cut off a man's private part in Las Vegas, and that was all it took for the detectives to consider her a primary suspect. But the strange thing is that Lobato completely denied her involvement in the crime. She even took a polygraph test that proved her innocence. When the trial began, she rejected an offer to a plea deal for a lesser sentence. Lobato describes the events of the night like this. She was in Las Vegas when a black man tried to assault her. Because she had her butterfly knife on her, she used it to defend herself and attacked the man's She didn't really know if her actions had severed his penis, but it gave her enough time to run while he was down on the ground, crying out in pain. The only discrepancy in the story was the timing, and that because Kirsten had been on when the whole thing happened. The prosecution theorized that Bailey was her dealer, and that because she had no money, Bailey asked her for favors in return for the Kirsten didn't want to do it, and that's when he assaulted her, resulting in her fighting him off with her knife and a baseball bat that she had in her car. Corinda Martin, an inmate at the Clark County Detention Center, testified that while awaiting the trial, Lobato had bragged that she amputated a man's penis and placed it down his throat. Martin went on to talk about how Kirsten had said that the man deserved what he got, implicating her in the crime. Kirsten's defense also presented witnesses who testified that she was actually in Panaca on the morning of the murder, which is where she stayed for the rest of the day. But the prosecution concluded that she had killed Bailey in the early hours of the morning and drove back to Panaca to cover up the crime. In May 2022, Kirsten was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 to 100 years in prison, while she was completely innocent. Why do we say this? Well, because during the trial, every piece of physical evidence seemed to exclude her from the crime. A shoe print that was too large to be hers, tire tracks that didn't match her car, and fingerprints and other bodily evidence found at the scene of the crime didn't match hers. But the reason why she was convicted was that the prosecutors painted her as a crazy meth addict whose mind had been scrambled after all the abuse she had been put through during her childhood. The prosecution ignored all the evidence of Kirsten being innocent, even their own forensic expert, who kept claiming that the murder was the work of a man. Kirsten's family was confident enough that she would be innocent, so they made her turn down a plea offer that would have dropped most of her sentence. But in an attempt to prove that she was innocent, Kirsten ended up spending 40 years behind bars.
Lobato's 2002 conviction was overturned by the Nevada Supreme Court. Justices found that Judge Valerie Vega made errors that deprived Lobato of a fair trial.
She would do whatever it took to get out of jail. She would lie to her sentencing court. She would lie to this court. Whatever it took to get out.
Lobato's second trial begins September 11th, 2006, and she is again assigned Judge Vega for the case.
Session Honorable Valerie J. Vega.
While she was in jail, more and more evidence kept surfacing to prove that she was not linked to the murder. First of all, it was proven that the only reason why Martin said all of those things about her was that she was desperate for an early release in exchange for information. So the inmate fabricated the entire story. One of Lobato's friends also came forward to testify that Kirsten had actually attacked her assaulter back in May, which was way before Bailey was found dead. After filing for a new trial and being denied repeatedly, Kirsten's case was finally reopened in 2017.
Blowflies will normally colonize very, very rapidly after somebody dies, and those eggs will be laid on the body. Those eggs will hatch after a predictable time. In certain situations, blowflies won't be able to get to a body immediately, and one of the big ones is nighttime. In my opinion, he died after it got dark. And from what I can see of the transcripts, nobody ever questioned the time of death, which was crucial. She had an alibi. The whole thing rested on time of death.
That is when forensic experts took a look at the evidence and came to the conclusion that blowflies started hovering around a dead body soon after death and lay hundreds of eggs that can easily be seen. And considering the fact that Bailey's body had no blowflies on it, it was evident that he died very close to when his body was discovered, maybe only a few minutes before. And Kirsten was 3 hours away from the site at the crime at that time, with her family in Panaca, so there was no way she could have been involved. A forensic pathologist then testified that Bailey had died during the evening hours of July 8th instead of the morning, freeing Kirsten from all charges and allowing her to be a free woman on December 19th, 2017, after spending 15 years in jail for a crime she never committed.
I have to start over. You know, my life is beginning again, so I have to get everything. I'm so overwhelmed and so happy and so grateful for all the people that have believed in me and fought for me for all these years. And you and I have a meeting. I'm gonna do exclusive with you. Did you ever think that you would see this day? I didn't.
After her exoneration, Kirsten cried tears of happiness and went outside to a host of reporters asking her how she felt. Her happiness was evident on her face as she hugged her friends and family, telling the reporters she was ready to start her life all over again. Today, Kirsten has filed federal rights lawsuit against the Las Vegas Police Department and 2 detectives investigating her case.
I know why we never returned to the moon. After I posted my last part of this story, I thought I'd be done with this. I really did. But I guess it doesn't really work that way, does it? How do I even start? The last week or so was, well, quite dramatic. I might need to break this up into a few posts to explain it in detail, so I apologize for any cliffhangers it might turn into. Anyway, this is what happened. I woke up in my home on the floor with a pounding headache. I confusingly stood up and took my phone out of my pocket to see what time it was. The battery was dead. I awkwardly walked into my bedroom and plugged my phone into the charger. As I glanced out of my window, I noticed that it was still dark outside, but the first rays of sunlight were slowly climbing above the horizon. What a night, I thought. I didn't usually drink much, but a terrible hangover was the only explanation to my current situation. It wouldn't have been the first one anyway. Suddenly, a loud banging on my door brought me to full awareness, and I realized that it was probably also the reason I woke up.
Miller, are you there?
The visitor yelled. I literally had no clue what was going on. In fact, I had no clue what I had done that night. It was a completely blank spot in my head. I grabbed a kitchen knife and carefully opened the door. Who the hell are you and what do you want? I asked the visitor, whom I had not seen once in my life, but apparently he knew who I was. What? Oh fuck, you found it, didn't you? I told you not to, you idiot! I fucking told you to let it go! I shouldn't have told you anything in the first place. Christ, you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about now, the man said. As I said, I had never seen this man in my life, but on second thought, his voice sounded familiar. But it took me a second to realize who he was. The same man who mailed me the confidential material I posted in the second part of the story. Pearson. Listen, kid, I know you're confused, but you have to trust me. You're not safe, or not after what you did. You need to come with me, he said. I hesitated for a few seconds, and then turned to head back inside to collect my things. Pearson grabbed my arm. Leave your stuff as it is. We need to get out of here, right now. You should thank God, or whatever you believe in, that they didn't find you yet, he exclaimed as he pulled me towards his car. The tires squealed as we sped off into the night. Who's trying to find me? What the fuck is going on? I demanded an answer, as I was trying to somewhat comprehend what just happened. Listen, it's too much to explain right now. Try not to think too much, and And don't try to recall what you did tonight, Pearson answered. I noticed that he was often looking at the sides and behind the car, as if he was trying to see if someone or something was following us. Of course, I did exactly what he told me not to do. I reached into my mind and tried to piece together any fragments of this night. A series of incomprehensible images started flashing in front of my eyes. Last thing I remember was Pearson slamming the pedal to the floor. I passed out. I woke up in a small gray room filled with a handful of medical equipment. I was immediately reassured to be awake. Actually, I was reassured that everything I had just experienced was just a dream. But then I realized that not all of it was. I looked around to survey my surroundings. The paint on the walls was old and dirty. The ceiling was supported by steel beams with early signs of corrosion. There were no windows anywhere in sight. I stood up and almost collapsed again. My head was still aching. I walked out of the room and entered a long, dimly lit corridor. There was a heavy steel door on both ends, and many smaller doors on the sides. One of them was open, leaking just a tiny bit more light into the corridor. I slowly approached. The room looked like some sort of command center. Loads of not exactly new electrical equipment, radios, monitors, computers, etc. There was a large table in the center. Pearson was standing right next to the table, seemingly examining some sort of map, but after a closer look, he was more likely lost in deep thought than actually paying attention to the map. "Pearson?" I announced my presence, pulling him back into reality. "You're awake. How do you feel, kid? You might want to take it a bit slower. Take a seat here. I'll explain what I can." I obliged. "Where are we?" I asked. "Someplace safe. Deep enough underground that they won't find us anytime soon." "You need to tell me what's going on, dude," I insisted. "Just let me talk. I'm trying to," he replied. "Last night, you called me and said that you had somehow found another message on your grandfather's note. You talked about something called the key, and that you burned the message. At least that's one thing you did, right? I told you not to do anything and wait for me, but when I had arrived at your home, you were already done. You remember any of that?" "No, just what happened after you arrived? Who are we running from?" "From them," he said, and pointed at a picture of the night sky with a full moon taped on a wall. I looked at it for a moment, at first not understanding, then wondering if this guy was serious. "No, it's not possible. I thought that it was all made up. I refuse to believe that. Look, if this is some kind of prank, it's really not funny anymore." "It's not a prank, and I don't care if you believe me or not. You're miles deep in this now, either way, since you didn't fucking listen to what I told you." I know this will probably sound a bit crazy, but from what we know, the moon is some kind of extrasolar object. It's been dormant for eons, but it's not anymore. Its inhabitants aren't, at least. They're searching for something here, on Earth. They've been here for a few years at least. Last night, you found it," he continued. "How do you know all this?" I asked. You're not the first one to find the key, obviously, since your grandfather wrote about it. An awful lot of people tried to keep it hidden, but it's almost as if it had a mind of its own. It never works, at least not forever." What Pearson was saying made sense in a way, but really, just in a way. One part of me still didn't want to believe him, and the other one wanted to know everything. "So why can't I remember it?" I asked. "You know, it's not easy to explain, but it does things to people. The key, I mean. It can mess you up really good." "What do you mean? What does it do?" "Now you're asking questions I can't answer. All I can say for sure is that it somehow gets inside your head. In the best case, it just mixes up a few things here and there. In the worst case, you completely lose your shit. So I guess you're one of the better cases." After he said that, he paused for a while, as if thinking what to say next, or perhaps how to say it. At least I had a few seconds to process all of this new information. Now, as I said, they'll do everything they can to find the key. That mustn't happen. Never. Do you understand? They must not get the key. If they do, well, bad things are going to happen. "What exactly?" He looked me in the eyes, and then glanced away. "I'm afraid I can't tell you anything more," he answered as he stared into the empty space. "Can't or won't?" I thought to myself. But honestly, I was unable to listen to this anymore. I had to take a break. Pearson showed me around the bunker, as he called it. There was a couple of bedrooms, an infirmary, a small kitchen, sort of living room, and a few administrative storage rooms. "This door leads to the surface," he said after we finished the tour. "Whatever you do, don't try to open it. It's locked anyway, so you won't be able to, but most of all, don't open the old door in the back." We continued, and glanced at the old heavy rusty door at the end of the corridor. "It leads to decommissioned areas of the bunker. It's not safe," he added a few moments later, just as I was about to elaborate. I walked into the kitchen and opened a can of soup. I later decided to try and put on some crappy movie on the TV in the common room to drive away my thoughts. It didn't work. I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened recently. I eventually managed to fall asleep. I had the same dream again that night, but I continued further than the last day. I was in front of the cave once again, but this time, I didn't wake up. I went inside. I don't know how long I roamed the underground tunnels. The cave was completely silent, unnaturally silent. No drips of water, no whistling of the wind, flapping of bat wings, or even my own echo. Nothing. Just dead silence. Then I reached a circular chamber. It also seemed unnatural. The walls were made out of rocky deposits and other cavernous formations, but the chamber was too round, too symmetrical to appear natural. There was something in the center, a black object, wrapped with layers of rock and sediments, the perfect sphere. I woke up, realizing I had no way of telling how much time had passed since Pearson brought me to the bunker. I've never been claustrophobic, but I had to admit that the complete lack of windows or any information from the outside was taking its toll. It made me think. Pearson was really the only person I've been able to talk to since yesterday. He could easily be misleading or using me, since I've been basically locked inside. I'd have no way to escape in case things really went south. Could I trust him? I guess I had to. Only time would tell what his real intentions were. But my biggest question was, what was really behind the old steel door? "You're finally awake, huh?" Pearson interrupted my series of thoughts. "I hope you're feeling better now, because we have a lot of work to do."